There we go. So welcome, everybody. My name is Teresa Kofi. I'm the PA president. And as part of our new program this year at OLL, known as the MasterClass Series, we brought in two masters to talk about something that pertains to all of us right now. This has just been an insane year. And as they point out, this is more like Wellness 2021. We're towards the end of the year now, but we're getting a little tired because so many darn things have happened. We have a pandemic ongoing, elections happening in the background, fires, financial fluctuations, school changes. It's just all been too much. And so we worry a lot about our kids, but as we do that, we kind of forget about ourselves, and over time are starting to feel more and more of a mounting pressure and stress in our own lives as well. So we're so very fortunate to have Christy Hanna and Shannon Odell here to talk with us. They're both experts, PhDs, and practicing psychologists. What's so fascinating here is that they both have specialty expertise. Shannon has background in child and adolescent psychology, and Christy deals more with adults. So they bring two different perspectives to one very complex issue. And most importantly, they're members of our own community. So we're so very pleased to have you, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Teresa. All right.
Step off the screen.
Okay. I'll share mine. Okay, hang on. Let's get the PowerPoint up and running. Here we go. All right, well, we're here to talk to you guys about this crazy year and hopefully less so of a crazy year to come, but to be determined, I suppose. So what we're just kind of trying to do today is talk to you guys about the challenges that we've all faced and how to cope with some of those challenges, some of the worries you might have about your children, and you know, what to look out for, what to do, what's okay, what's not okay. So that's sort of the overall goal today. So we're going to do a brief PowerPoint presentation to start, and then we'll end and hopefully spend most of the time in sort of a Q&A format with our lovely Parent Association President, Teresa. So hopefully you will learn a thing or two, or at least leave with some new knowledge or some things to think about. So before we start, we have to give a disclaimer. You know, the advice that we're giving you today is not a substitute for therapy or other types of professional advice. So if you have any concerns about yourself or your child's well-being, it's really important that you discuss with your pediatrician or your PCP, or find another mental health professional out in the community to discuss these things with. So we just need to say that really legally. So anyway, so here's a little bit of background about me. I don't like talking about myself, so I'll let you guys read through it on your own. The only thing that I will point out is the last one, that I have two wonderful stepchildren who are enrolled at OLL, Anna and Jack Spink. Anna's in 6th grade, Jack is in 4th. And I also have a 1-year-old daughter who's just a delight, and a husband who very often requires some additional parenting. So apparently I'm a parenting expert across all age ranges. And I'm going to turn it over to Christy so she can do the same.
So hello to everyone. As you can see, some background information on me. I think the important thing as well is I work with young adults to older adults and focused a lot on kind of anxiety and depression and stress. So pass it back to you, Shannon. That's enough.
That's enough. We only have an hour to talk about a lot of
that's right. We don't have time.
Big topics. So we are not going to be any of those topics you need to hear about. All right. So I wanted to start today by talking about some oh my gosh, it's going to be one of those days. Mental health myths. So the fact versus the fiction, right? So I think that one of the things I find in therapy is I spend some time with parents just sort of managing expectations and really adjusting expectations about what's typical and what's not typical. And so I think the first two in particular are things that I find having a conversation about a lot. So mental health means feeling happy or content all the time is the myth that I hear a lot, right? That if I'm not feeling happy or content, then there must be something wrong. And that's just not the case. Mental health means mental health really means experiencing the right feeling at the right time and that you're able to weather it, right? So during a time like this, during a time like 2020, moving into 2021, when a lot of stuff is still up in the air, you would expect a lot of stress, you would expect a lot of anxiety, you would expect some sadness and some anger. So those are the right feelings to be having at this time. The question is, are you and your children able to weather it, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. How do you weather it? So the next mental health myth is that mental health in children specifically means they listen and follow the rules. They don't show negative emotion, right? When in fact, a child's job is to test boundaries. So acting up, showing negative emotions, getting upset, getting angry, it doesn't always indicate that they're struggling with their mental health. It may be exactly the opposite. It might be that they're having that right feeling at the right time, right? So I think those are just some really important things to keep in mind. The other two that I think are just important to touch on are that if you are struggling with mental illness, or if your child is in fact struggling with some mental illness, you know, I think there's this conception that if I'm struggling with mental illness, it must mean I'm weak. Or if my child's struggling with mental illness, it means I'm a bad parent. And I want you to know that those things are not true, that there are so many factors involved in developing a mental health issue. There's biological factors, genetic factors, environmental factors. You're not weak or you're not a bad parent. There's just a lot at play that can influence whether someone develops a mental health issue. And then the last one is, you know, I think a myth that is slowly starting to become less of an issue, but the myth that children don't or shouldn't struggle with their mental health. And that's just, it's not true. Yes, they can, and they do, and they have for at least documented for over a century, right? Sigmund Freud, one of the founders of our field, his daughter worked with children. So this field goes back a long, long ways. We know that kids struggle with their mental health, and that there is now a lot of treatment out there for kids who are struggling. So that's the good news. So let's talk about all of this in the context of a pandemic. Parenting in a pandemic. We are so over it, aren't we? I know I am. So I think, you know, for the past 8 or 9 months, as parents, we have been trying to make this all okay for our kids, right? We're holding ourselves together the best we can. We're doing backflips trying to make things nicer for our kids because we're so worried about the conditions that we're under. The question becomes, how do we know if what we're doing is working to protect them, right? So the question is, how do we protect our kids? Have we been protecting our kids? And so, you know, looking at kind of the big picture of all this, it feels like, in my opinion, and I am one voice, by the way, of many. So if I say anything tonight that you don't agree with, there's likely a psychologist out there that will sort of have more of a closer alignment with your views or values. So just keep that in mind. But our goal should be to come out the other side of this pandemic psychologically intact. So I think there's a lot of room for latitude right now in a lot of different areas. And again, I'll talk more about that when it comes to coping. But, you know, I think we just need to really try to push through this so that we aren't putting too much pressure on our kids, we're not putting too much pressure on ourselves, and that we emerge on the other side of this feeling like we're okay. We're okay. And And so as parents, the best way that we can protect our kids is to set the emotional tone for our children. So there's a quote here by a psychologist I really like about setting that emotional tone for our children, right? Our chaos or our calm are contagious, especially to the people we spend the most time with, which we all know how much time we've been spending with our families lately. And so, neurologically, we're wired to pick up on each other's sort of emotional states. And so as parents, if we're in chaos, if we're stressed, then the kid is probably going to pick up on that and display some of that themselves. So being a calm presence, right? I like the idea of a calm, steady presence. Hold yourself steady, listen intently, offer empathy when they're having those emotional moments through this really, really hard time, right? I think a really great line that works pretty often is just, "Oh, honey, that stinks," right? That's the worst. That must be so hard. I think the other thing that we do as parents is we try to solve their problems. When they come to us with an emotion, we want to fix the feeling. And that's not always the way to approach a situation because they're left not necessarily getting the validation they need. And I think women, we can all relate to when, we are talking to our husbands and they're all of a sudden in fix it mode and we tell them, we don't want you to fix it. We just want you to listen. And kids feel the same way about us as their parents, right? I didn't want your advice. I didn't want a life lesson on why this is going to be okay. I just wanted someone to say, oh, that stinks. So really focusing on being calm and steady, validating what they're saying when they're in those emotional states, and connection. That is how we protect our kids, is making sure that we're keeping those connections strong, because connection is really at the basis of mental health and a fulfilling life. So make sure you're working on connecting with your kids. Now, I think the question that a lot of parents come to me with is, when should I worry? Like, when should I be concerned? And this goes back to having the right feeling at the right time and being able to weather it, right? So I think if your child doesn't seem like they're weathering the storm, if they are getting upset and they're staying upset, that's a cause for concern, right? If they're upset about the fact that they had to have a Zoom birthday party instead of an in-person birthday party, and they're upset about it for the rest of the day, that makes sense. That's not a cause for concern. But if a week later or 2 weeks later or a month later, they're as upset about it or pretty close to as upset about it as they were before, then we might have something more going on. The other thing that we need to worry about is if they're using bad coping. So usually I use unhealthy and healthy coping strategies instead of good and bad, but I think there's truly some bad coping going on these days. So I'm just going to use those more black and white terms for today's purposes. And I'm going to start with the bad coping skills, since that's sort of what I'm leading into this next slide with. But, I think there's a lot of things that kids are doing and adults are doing. I'm not going to leave this solely on the kids' shoulders. That it's not so helpful. And in fact, it's likely making things worse. The only problem with bad coping is it's usually the easiest coping, right? Good coping actually takes a lot of work and can be kind of exhausting on its own. But bad coping, like I said, it just leads to more problems down the road. So whenever possible, we want to be encouraging good coping. But so bad coping is learned helplessness, right? Like believing that there's just nothing I can do about anything. They feel like there's nothing in their sphere of control. Spending all day in bed, not good coping. Avoiding responsibilities if they're not helping out around the house like they used to, or that you're expecting them to. That might be an indication that something else is going on. Aggressive outbursts. I think parents, I would guess, have probably seen an increase in some of this, especially with their younger kids whose worlds have sort of been turned upside down. And that in a way is to be expected, but as a parent, you don't have to tolerate that. I think there's very much room for you to say, you know what, I understand that you're angry right now, but I can't let you fill in the blank, hit, kick, bite, punch, whatever, throw things, and have them go hang out in their room for a little bit until they're calmer. And I think that if after a couple of those steady, calm talks about aggressive outbursts and it's not getting better, then you can kind of turn into a more consequences oriented posture, and start taking away things, or doing timeouts, or whatever your family values are around punishment and consequences. Binging or restricting food, eating disorder rates have really gotten high during this pandemic. And I think there's a lot of reasons why, but we don't have enough time to go into that right now. But I think that's something to look out for in your kids, especially in your older kids. I mean, we've all been doing maybe a little bit of binging this pandemic, right? With sweets, and we're all baking apparently and things like that. But, I think that just watching your kids' food habits, and seeing how, if those have changed at all, and if you're seeing concerning weight gain or weight loss, those are things to kind of pay attention to, and definitely talk to your pediatrician about if you are concerned. And then the other thing that's really gone through the roof over the pandemic is bullying. So, if that's happening, then that means there are kids out there that are bullying, and they're probably doing it to make themselves feel better. They make others feel bad to make themselves feel better. So I think that bullying has probably gone up because more kids are spending time on screens, and in formats where they're just kind of open to bullying, and kids are more likely to be bullies. So that's just something to also be aware of. And if your kids' behavior has sort of changed all of a sudden, and that's a place where you do see them spending a lot of time, that might be something you want to check into. So good coping, sort of the anecdote to all of that, I think a good coping strategy is getting upset when something is hard. I worry less about those kids who are showing emotion than I do about what we call internalizers, right? So kids who kind of stuff down their emotions and don't let them come out. That's not necessarily a great way to cope either. So getting upset when something is hard, that's totally okay. And then the emotion comes out, and then it can kind of be dealt with, which is wonderful. Happy distractions. So I bet you all thought I was going to put screen time in a bad coping column, but like I said in the beginning, there is a lot of room for latitude right now with certain things, and I think screen time is definitely one of those things. Screen time is a happy distraction. I think in a time when we are all feeling like there's not a ton to look forward to, we're not necessarily taking vacations right now, this is a mental break for our kids and for us. I'm watching more TV during the pandemic. I think our brains just need that break. So, I don't see as much of a problem with it during these times. And again, that might be a little bit controversial, but hopefully I feel maybe I'm letting a lot of you off the hook. Screen time is okay. Also, writing, drawing, dancing, other stuff too. So happy distractions are good coping. Relaxation strategies are good coping. You can kind of read through the list right there. Deep breathing, mindfulness. And actually, my stepson, his class is doing the Frenzy curriculum. I think all of the classes are. And I don't know if they're all doing the same Frenzy curriculum, but he's so cute. He always comes to me and he's like, Shannon, we've got another Frenzy video. And he sits me down and we watch them together because they're very much oriented to what I do. And there was one he just saw. It was called Find Your Calm. And it had all sorts of these relaxation strategies. It taught kids how to deep breathe. It taught kids how to implement mindfulness. It taught kids a lot of positive self-talk strategies. It was just so great. So, maybe looking through your Frenzy curriculum book with your kid and sort of seeing if there's something that they can use when times are tough for them, when they're feeling overwhelmed. Positive self-talks, we call those the cognitive strategies, right? Reframing difficult emotions or difficult times. And then active movement. So, getting out there and moving. I'm a happier person and a nicer person after I exercise. I know that for a fact. So my kids are too, right? So sports, walking, riding bikes, indoor obstacle courses, if it's raining outside, TikTok dance routines, those are fine. At least they're moving, right? So I think there's a lot of things that kids could be doing to cope better. And as parents, you can encourage that, but trying to remember that, your children are their own little autonomous beings. And so you can encourage the good coping, you can give them good coping options. It doesn't always mean they're going to choose that. And that's, again, why it's important to try to remain that calm, steady presence so that at least they have you as a safe sounding board to kind of push things onto. And as we as parents have to absorb that. And so, I was joking with Christy and Teresa the other day. I feel like a lot of you are here to hear what I have to say, but you're going to get the most out of what Christy has to say. That I think you're going to leave this talk being like, thank God Christy was there. So I'm going to hand it over to her so she can go through her content with you.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. I think that's a tall order that she just put out there. Talk about an expectation. But what I'm going to talk about today piggybacks off of what she said. This idea that we're trying to get to this calm, steady place. And how do we get there, right? We have the desire to get there, but this is hard. Everyone is feeling quite a bit of stress right now. And we have for quite a long time. We make so many decisions, do so many risk evaluations. Just the question of what's for lunch can set us off, right? So I think we all acknowledge that we're under quite a bit of stress, and that's reflected, not surprisingly, by the statistics, up to 30% increase in clinical levels of anxiety, depression, and insomnia. So we're really struggling right now as a country with stress. So what do we do about it? I think everyone has heard the expression, put on your mask before your oxygen mask, before you put it on your child, right? And I think this has never been more critical than it is right now. To get to that calm, steady place, it's going to be really important that we learn, how do we put that mask on ourselves? And Shannon's helping me here with the slides. You want to skip to the, yeah. So there's a author I really like. He's a international researcher, and his name is Russ Harris, and he has a book called Reality Slap: Finding Peace and Fulfillment When Life Hurts. This idea, he defines a reality slap as anything that happens in life that kind of throws you off balance. It could be financial stress, loss of a job, it could be divorce, it could be loss of somebody that you love, it could be grieving things that you used to be able to do, like in-person school. It can be anything related to what we're dealing with right now with the pandemic. And the framework he operates from that I think is helpful is he talks about this idea that there's an expectation here that we all have in our mind, and then there's a reality. And the greater the gap between those two things is where the distress lies. So I think with that, not that we needed to make sense of why are we so stressed right now, but many things we're dealing with aren't things we expected we would have on our plates. And one place to start is to reflect on, what can I do to maybe recalibrate that expectation? What's reasonable right now for me to expect of myself, or maybe even expect of my kids? How about the next one, Shannon? So yeah, this is just this idea of, I think many of us have felt like this cartoon character multiple times. I know I did a couple times today, even before this talk. So we do need to focus on taking care of us. We cannot be that calm presence unless we figure out what's going on for us as parents. How about the next one? So when I work with clients and they come into my office in the olden days, what I would do is we would draw a balloon. And one of the things I would do is say, imagine you as this balloon and all your stress going into the balloon. And whatever stressors that come up for you, not what your partner or your kids think is stressful, but what you think is stressful. And we'd fill up the balloon and we'd notice how tense is that balloon? Is it about to pop? And we would first walk through our controllables. What can we do? What things can we take off the table or manage differently? But after we walked through that, we would talk about how do we manage the stress in this balloon so that it doesn't feel like it's going to pop. And I didn't say control it, I said manage the stress. So one of the more helpful ways that I see looking at stress buffering tools is to come up with a bunch of different little things. There's not just one thing. I wish there was a magical thing I could tell you today. If you only do this, your stress will be gone, right? But it doesn't exist that way. It's a bunch of little things over time that can help reduce the tension in that balloon and help us work toward that place of being that calm presence. One of the first ones is talking about managing your emotions. It's a pretty tall order, right? We often want to control them. But the funny thing about emotions is the more you try to control it, the more the emotions control you. So we're talking about managing emotions like a dial on one of those old stereos that you would manually turn down. Learning how to turn on the relaxation response. We know we're under stress. Biologically, there is a huge host of neurotransmitters, stress hormones that are released. They're trying to prepare us to either fight or flee a situation, right? And that's helpful in certain situations, but certainly not when we are struggling in this moment right now, okay? And we are in this chronic stress situation and we can't change it. So some aspects we can reduce stress, but there's this term, relaxation response, was coined by a Harvard psychologist. And what he talks about is kind of the antidote. How to counterbalance the stress is to look to ways to promote relaxation. I'll touch on media and internet exposure, a little bit about communication and improvement, and the big three of self-care, which are sleep, exercise, and nutrition. There's my handy how you reduce. See the way that balloon got such a much more manageable size. Seemed so much cooler when I was practicing it right there. So what are some of these strategies? How do we manage emotions? Really, emotions aren't really good or bad. As much as I know we like to think of them that way, you can imagine them as little messengers trying to teach us something, trying to tell us something. And it's not so much the emotion that's troubling. We might have a quick reaction to whatever emotion, but what we're talking about when we talk about managing emotions is how do we slow that down so that we can control our response to the emotion. So how do we do that? I think one of the best ways to think about it is to think of the last time that you felt like maybe you blew your top. You got frustrated, you yelled at the kids or your partner. Maybe you were busy working with one kid all day, went to check with the other one. They said they were done with their homework and they weren't. Okay. And you immediately went to, are you kidding me? You said you were done. You didn't practice your recorder. You didn't start your art project. It's due tomorrow. You didn't finish your Spanish. Whatever it is can set you off. And you yell, they yell, you leave the room, and here comes this vicious cycle of stress. When you look back at that moment later, not in the moment, but later in the moment, and look at what else was going on for me in that moment. Sure, I was frustrated. I felt like I was wearing too heavy of a responsibility cape. But am I worried about dropping the ball? Did I miss other things he or she should be doing? Are they going to be doing well enough? Will they get into the high school? What about the job? We often catastrophize. It's so much more than whatever's going on in just that moment. So I think it's important to pay attention to and learn to identify what can be going on for me when I have these situations where I feel like I lose it. I feel completely overwhelmed. And to reflect back on those and say, those are kind of my trigger situations. Maybe it's paying the bills. Maybe it's talking about what's for dinner. Maybe it's checking in on the kids. But knowing that during that time, how do I kind of brace myself? How do I let a little steam out of my balloon so I can be that calm presence and be prepared for whatever they choose to respond to, whatever question I have. And I think it'd be helpful too to plan, you know what, I might not get the response I want. So can I buy myself some time? Can I take a deep breath? Not to get rid of the emotion, but to create some space so I don't just react in the moment, but I choose how to respond. Now, talking about relaxation tools can be a whole talk in of itself. The relaxation response, as I mentioned earlier, is important. It's actually a skill set that we can learn. Okay. And there's simple breathing. One of the most simple tools that a lot of clients that I work with really like is called box breathing. And what you do is you imagine a box and you breathe in through your nose for a count of 4. You hold it for a count of 4. You breathe out through your mouth for a count of 4. And then you breathe normal for a count of 4. And you do that about 4 times over and over again. And just notice what it feels like. Notice how it can kind of calm your body. And I encourage people to practice it maybe right before you get out of bed in the morning, while you're in the shower, before you get a workout in, maybe when you sit down for a brief moment, any time that you can to practice it, because it's a skill that we have to practice to learn. Now, there's many other ways, and you can Google them. I know Shannon mentioned a few. There's progressive muscle relaxation, there's body scan, there's a host of simple breathing exercises that you could Google and see which one is right for you. But this is important because this lets a little steam out. So whatever stressor your partner, your kids might add to that balloon, you've got more room for it, right? If there's any one trait early on that a team of psychologists said is helpful to make it through this pandemic, it's mindfulness. It's being able to stay in the present moment, in this one moment right here. When I was in Boston, I called my niece, and she was 3 at the time. And I said, Gabrielle, what are you doing? And she said, Auntie, I'm talking to you. Right? And when we ask that question of each other, what am I doing? I'm finishing with clients. I'm about to give a talk. We never stay as truly in the moment. We're worried about, will there be digital school or online? What's it going to be like in January? Boy, did they learn enough this fall. So it's hard for us to stay in the moment and live moment by moment. But being able to learn this trait right now can be hugely helpful when we're in this chronic stress situation. Headspace is an app that you can follow. I like to have some structure and something to kind of help practice. It's something that actually my kids even enjoy. They have cartoon animations that I think are great visualizations for adults. There's mindfulness pieces of it. My youngest, Amelia, after she gets done chatting and downloading the day, she loves to walk through and listen to some of these different types of apps that can be from 2 minutes to 20 minutes. When I was in grad school, I remember them saying, to do some of these tough trauma clients, you're really going to have to learn how to channel relaxation from one client to the other. And I thought, I don't have time for that. They said, why don't you try this one thing, this mnemonic device? Okay. It's stop. S, stop. T, take a breath. O, observe what's going on. P, pause. And P, proceed back in what you're doing. And I thought, all right, I can do that. I can have time for that. And that let a little sip of air out of my balloon. To be able to do that, I didn't try to fix it. I didn't jump in there and say, what was that emotion? I didn't overanalyze it. I just noticed it to create a little space for myself. Now, another way to kind of create this way of self-soothing. I was talking to Mrs. H in the office, and she said, when the weather starts to get bad, one of the ways we deal with it, we light candles everywhere. And she was on to something. There's a fancy word for it, I can't remember, in Danish word, for how to create this kind of cozy environment. And it's about lighting candles, putting a fire in the fireplace, putting on cozy socks and sweatshirts, listening to relaxing music, or reading something light, or watching something funny. We know it has a positive impact on our immune system. It's a great release, and we need it. Maybe before we could watch more intense dramas, but now we might need the light stuff. So these are all different ways to try to create this state of relaxation. And again, it's a skill to learn. It doesn't get rid of an emotion. We're trying not to control emotions. We're trying to manage them. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about, super important right now, I think there was a study that said married couples spent not more than 5 hours awake hours together every day pre-pandemic, and now it's something like 15. So we know the amount of time that the irritation comes from, you didn't put that in the recycling. We've got a lot more moments in the day for that. And the interesting thing is many of us aren't taking time to communicate what's working and what's not working, right? If you imagined your household as a Fortune 500 business, do you think that they would ever proceed forward without having a conversation about how the roles have changed? Many of us are wearing many, many more roles than they did before, and just some of the stressors and what's working and what's not working. So again, this is hard. There's so many different tools that I could talk about with this. One warning is don't use extreme language. You always do it this way. I'm always responsible for this. You never help with this. Rather, it's not in the moment of being upset, planning, hey, can we have a family talk? Or can you and I talk about what's going on? I need to game plan a little bit about this week. You know, I really like it when you helped unload the dishwasher, but what I could use more help with is that you take over Tuesday nights for dinner. And you have to be open to tell me what works and doesn't work for you. The other big thing is alone time. The dirty little secret is everybody, including the kids, want alone time. They want time away from us as much as we need time away from everyone in our family. And it doesn't mean we don't love them. It means we're being realistic. So how do we create that? Maybe one night it's everybody go to your quarters and watch a show. Maybe it's go for a walk. Can you go for a walk with yourself? We'll go together later. But it's having these types of conversations and keeping the open dialogue. Now, internet and media. One thing, it's absolutely amazing that we have this resource. I can't even believe I was alive and in schooling before all of this was as easy at my fingertips as it is now. But we do know widespread media exposure amplifies stress. And if we were to hook ourselves, our heart rate and blood pressure up to constantly, I know we're distracting ourselves by our phones and the internet, but the constant barrage of information we're getting about the pandemic, about social injustices, maybe about the election, about online schooling, it's stressful. And it's constantly stressing us and releasing those stress hormones without giving us something productive to do about it. Many of my clients would say, yeah, I get it, but you know what? Knowledge is power. And I would say, do you need to check every hour for that knowledge? Could you check once a day? And what time of day do you check? So I encourage people, turn off the notifications on your phone, plan when you're going to look at the media, and do it early enough in the day, and try not to check multiple times a day. Take a break from it and see what it's like. One thing to remember is, like it or not, we're not only a model of kind of the emotional thermostat in the house for our family, but we're a model of digital use. We can't say, get your head out of the phone if we're constantly on our phone. Creating times where, you know what, the phone isn't going to come to the dinner table. Don't charge your phone. Don't bring your phone to bed. So I think talking about this and it has to come again, as Shannon said, everybody has different perspectives on it. But I would just I was a scientist before a psychologist, try a little experiment. What's it like if you take a day off from the news or a weekend off? Tell me if you feel like you missed something, or if you feel maybe your stress level went down a little. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about are the big three. I work with a neurologist up at OHSU, wonderful woman, and she works with a lot of folks with multiple sclerosis. And one thing about that illness is stress induces symptoms. So folks I work with, paying attention to these big three, they're essential. They are not optional, because if they don't, their body responds in a stressful way. So it's something to take from that and say, right now, we're all in that chronic state. We are all having that much stress that we have to pay attention to these three. The first one is sleep. Sleep is absolutely essential. We know how important it is and how it impacts our mood. I think of when our kids were babies, if they didn't get a nap, what were they like? I think of all the ways, if you were one that had to read the books on best ways to get babies to sleep, what did you do? What is good sleep hygiene? It's often putting them to bed at the same time every night, having a cool room, signaling the transition. It's time to go to bed. Wind down time. Maybe it's a bath and swaddling them. How do we do that for ourselves? Watching caffeine. Obviously not for babies, but watching caffeine and even alcohol, right? Alcohol might be great to help unwind you to fall asleep, but it does disrupt REM sleep, and being mindful of that. So paying attention to sleep is super critical right now, and I know is a tough one, but is one to prioritize, and media exposure can really sabotage that. Exercise is so important that it's now an arm Research-based treatments for anxiety and depression say we got to add getting people moving. And talk about expectations. We often can't work out the same way we used to. Maybe our gym's not open, or maybe we don't feel comfortable going, or we just don't have the energy because everything feels a little harder right now. So how do we flex? How do we adapt? How do we pivot and try something different that maybe we didn't do before? Maybe we enlist a friend and try to FaceTime while trying a new strength workout. Maybe we say, you know, all I can do is get outside for 10 minutes today, or a couple times a day. But getting out and letting little sips of air is huge for releasing the tension in that balloon. And finally, mindful eating, not only during the pandemic, but this time of year. Sugar, caffeine, alcoholic beverages, treats are everywhere. And I think it's hard. Everyone has to find what feels right for them. But I like to ascribe to a 50% rule. Maybe you decide 50% of the time you're going to worry about it. You know what? During the week, I'm trying not to have as much sweets, but on the weekend, I'm going to have what I want. Or maybe not so worried, I'm going to stay hydrated because I know dehydration is hard. I'm going to have water next to me when I'm working or I'm helping with the kids. Maybe it's paying attention, you know, I like my goodies, but I could bolster a few more fruits and veggies into my diet. So paying attention to nutrition is important. Now, I'm not someone who I used to believe, boy, if we just could think positively, we can all get through this. We're all in this together. Now, I do believe that in order to get through this together, we have to be authentic and we have to be true to what our experience is. And it's not just positive, it's hard. This is really hard for everyone. We all feel overwhelmed and lose it. And frankly, if you say, nope, the pandemic's all good, I never am overwhelmed, I'd be a little concerned of how insightful you are to what's going on and what an emotion stuffer you just might be. But I think it's important. Positive thinking is important, but in balance. So one of the things I like to say, we never asked for this pandemic, the social injustices, the fires, all the stress, the digital learning. But are there silver linings? What silver linings can we find from this difficult time? And how do we acknowledge and how do we pay attention to those? That leads into another practice that I think is helpful for people, which is to have gratitude statements. Now, I'm not trying to say be grateful and forget all the hard stuff. No, you've got to acknowledge the hard stuff. But daily gratitude statement, what's one thing you could say that you're grateful for today? I'm grateful that it's at the end of a long week and I'm healthy. I'm grateful that I've got this to look forward to. I'm grateful that we had a moment of sunshine to get outside today despite the rain. Whatever gratitude statement, having that to hold on to is important. So once we acknowledge what's going on and that this is hard, then we can look with hope and think positive about how we're going to get through this together. And we're fortunate as an OLL community that this many people showed up on an evening, on a Thursday, to listen to how to manage stress. You're already ahead of the curve and your willingness to learn more tools for your tool bucket. Now, finally, the last thing I'll talk about before I'll turn it over are red flags. How do I know when you tell me everyone's stressed, we're all overwhelmed. I don't know if I should worry about me. Should I reach out for help? Now, I want to say you don't need to reach out for help when you've hit rock bottom, okay? Pretty much everyone in the world could benefit from some additional support. That doesn't mean you need it. But I do think some of the red flags for when you should reach out and see if more support is needed is if you listened to the tips that both Shannon and I provided today and you feel too overwhelmed to implement any of them. Not one. That's a sign that, whoa, you're wearing a pretty heavy backpack of stress right now. Do you feel like you have a short fuse all the time? Even if you implement some of these ways to let a little tension out of your balloon, do you feel like it's just out of control? You cannot manage it. That's when you may need to reach out for some additional support. Most people worry about, 1 to 4 Americans worry every day, at least 10% of the day. And worrying's not a bad thing. It can be productive, right? If we're planning and we think about it, it helps us plan. But the type of worry that's paralyzing, that we can't make decisions, that occupies more than 50% of our day and starts to ruminate over and over in our mind, That's the type of worry we might need some more cognitive strategies, more things than I could even touch on today in this talk. And finally, do you feel you can't find joy in anything? If I asked you to make a list, what are the things you enjoy? If you would say, I have no idea. I know things have changed. Going to the grocery store, totally different experience. People don't make eye contact. You go down the wrong way. You look like, I mean, it's tough business today. But finding a book you might enjoy, finding something that brings you joy, and being able to look forward to. If you can't find any of that, it doesn't mean I'm clinically depressed or anxious, but it means you're vulnerable and you're heading down that hill. And maybe it's time to reach out to your primary care provider or mental health provider and say, hey, what do you think about some more support? So thank you for taking the time to listen. This is not a forum I've ever done before virtual, so I appreciate your attention and patience. And let's turn it over to Dr. Teresa for some questions.
Thank you, ladies. Oh my goodness, what an informative talk. I couldn't stop writing notes. And maybe there's a diagnosis there that you need to work on.
Attentiveness, conscientiousness.
Yes,
There's no
a lot of
pathology to
detail,
that.
getting it all down.
Mild
That's it.
OCD, maybe a little.
Willingness to listen.
Yes, well, gosh, thank you so much again. I'm sure the community would agree with me that this just brings so much for us to work with to improve our lives. And you hit on a lot of the key points that I think families were concerned about. As you know, when we registered for this event, you had the option to submit some questions. So I have a list of questions here, and we've kind of mishmashed them together because some of them were similar. So you may not hear your exact question asked, but we've got it covered, okay? As best we can. And do know that we have about 10 minutes left, so we'll do what we can with the time.
Yeah.
So Shannon, you had one of the biggest questions out there from parents is a concern about screen time.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine how when you hear to let the screen time happen, some folks might be like, wait, I thought there were limits. What's too much? How can you tell when things are too much?
It's a fair question. And I think my earlier statement is I stand by it, but it also does come with some limitations, right? I think that, I am maybe on the more liberal side of screen time in terms of people in my field. It doesn't concern me as much as some other people. There's certain aspects of screen time that really concern me, and I might talk about those. But I think that as long as your kiddo is engaging in a variety of activities, right? So there's variety in their life, that they're engaging in household chores and helping around the house. They're moving their body. They are going outside sometimes. They're getting good grades, right? That I think the guardrails for screen time don't necessarily need to be quite as stringent as maybe kids where that's not happening, right? That screen time has taken up too much of their sphere. I think, the other things I think about with screen time, screen time really doesn't fry a kid's brain the way that we are afraid it does. There's really only one instance where screen time actually has lasting real damage on a kid's brain, and that's porn. So I'm assuming that that's not what kids are spending all day watching. So with that, I just say, try to prolong that exposure as long as possible. Just be aware that, a lot of kids have their first exposure to pornography on YouTube. So make sure that you're sort of monitoring what your kids are watching as much as you can. But, the other thing I think about in terms of when screen time is too much is if it's disrupting sleep, right? If a kid is bringing their device to their room and they're staying up until 2 and 3 in the morning and they're exhausted all day. And I think those are real concerns, and it is okay to put limits on kids if screen time is disrupting sleep. Because like Christy talked about, is sleep is important for us. It's really important for our kids. And so you just want to make sure screen time isn't getting in the way of all of that. I think the way that I think about screen time, again, it's a happy distraction. And in a time like this with the pandemic, you know, screen time can disrupt a worry loop. And I think that it's very easy to get stuck in a worry loop these days where we're just kind of going around and around about all the things that are worrying and stressful, and kids are no exception to that, right? And so screen time can stop it. It can stop the worry loop from happening. It can take your mind and do something else with it. And that gives our body a break. We're not having those stress hormones released into our system anymore when we're able to do that. So there's some actual benefits to letting your kids sort of just escape on screens for a little bit. So again, I think there's room for latitude now. There's going to probably come a time when this pandemic is behind us that we're going to have to sort of rein it in again. But for now, you know, I don't want parents to feel like, oh God, now I have to manage this too, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of my take on screens. I think the other thing I have a lot of concerns about with screens is social media. And, you know, there's just nothing good in the research about social media, like nothing. And so I think if you notice your kid is sort of not necessarily, if your child has a phone and has social media, I think that you just want to be aware of how they're reacting when they get off of social media, how much time they're spending on social media, and maybe even have a conversation with them about, like, are you getting something out of this? Are you getting out of this what you think you should be getting out of this? So anyway, that's sort of the last thing that I would just kind of be aware of. But it all comes down to your family values and what you think is important. And so, so listen to that too. Don't just listen to me.
That's great. So I'll switch over to you, Christy. I've got some really great questions about being at home with your family and how it's driving everybody nuts. One question was, how the heck do you get my husband out of the house? And you know who you are. Any advice there? How can we live together?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think, you know, the first thing that I would say with that is we have to be honest with ourselves that everybody needs a break from each other. And I think it's important that I have a colleague, an old grad school buddy, and she said, guess what? I'm not doing any family vacations. The only breaks I'm getting are when I go away for a day. We're not going with everyone because we're together all the time. So it's really shifting and coming up with what can I do? And not all of us have a separate quarter or an upstairs or a downstairs to ship everybody off to get some space. But the first thing I would say is have a conversation and acknowledge, look, we all need a little break. Everybody's driving everybody a little crazy as much as we have nice moments together. And propose times of day, like the little sips of air. You might not be able to kick your husband out to work back in the olden days like he used to, but can you leave for a chunk of the day and go for a walk? Can you encourage your husband or your wife or your grandma or whoever is around to take the kids out of the house for just an hour? Take them for a long drive to Dutch Brothers and get a hot cocoa. Whatever it is that gives you a little bit of a break away. But I think it's tough right now, and being okay with maybe you have a day where you have connected time, but you find ways to escape and tell everybody, you know what, it's actually okay if everyone kind of takes some downtime tonight in your room. We don't all have to hang out together. So I wish, again, there was a perfect way, except there's light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccines online. So keep looking at that and taking it kind of moment by moment, but honoring you might need to go upstairs and spend a little more time on your own or downstairs. And if you're working or spending time with the kids, build transition or what I call commute time back in. Give yourself a couple minutes before you go back and re-enter the world with the family, if you can, and have some boundaries and communicate it. There was a funny thing on, I don't know, the internet at some point that showed some dad who was working with, you know, if you're not bleeding and dying and this, like, don't knock on the door. I think having a conversation about this, and, you know, if you've got to put a block out to make sure they don't come in so you get a few minutes, tell them, Mom, Dad needs a little break right now. And, you know, that's hard. Not everybody, but most people are feeling the same thing.
Thanks, Christy. Okay, Shannon.
Yes.
A lot of questions about the social impact of the current environment that we're living. Parents are concerned about social distancing, especially with the younger kids, wearing masks and having to learn new ways to gesture and communicate to one another. Do you think that impacts their development, their social development specifically?
That's a good question, and it's likely to vary from kid to kid. I think on the whole, I'm not too worried about it. And the reason I'm not too worried about it is kids are pretty resilient. I think that, the real connection they need right now is us as their parents. And we're giving them plenty of social interaction, as Christy's last question just alluded to. I think that, social interaction with each other is of course important. And I think a lot of kids are missing their friends who aren't able to see them. And there's a lot of pitfalls to not being able to see your kids or to see your friends. But I think that once we're all together again, they'll recalibrate, they'll bounce back. But when I think about a question like that, I also think about kind of what's the intention behind the question. And maybe it's like, what should I be looking out for when my kids, like, how will I know if something's wrong once they get back together? And I think the thing that you probably need to look for in a kiddo who's maybe looking like they're struggling a little bit is social avoidance, right? So if they're not wanting to have play dates with their friends, or if they're nervous about, seeing people again, and the nervousness doesn't go away after a few times of kind of getting back together, those are probably reasons for concern. It's possible some social anxiety has cropped up because of the distance from friends, but I think that's sort of the primary thing to look out for. I think the masks don't really concern me that much, because kids are finding other ways to communicate.
It is alarming how rapidly they adapted to masks.
Yeah.
If they can adapt that well in one direction, I'm sure they can switch it around and go the other.
Yeah, and kids are way more adaptable than we are, So, I think that the littles who are there, the K through 3, they're probably just fine. And who knows how long the mask wearing will happen for, but I think it's annoying, and it's not ideal, but I think it's not, I don't think it's anything to be too worried about. I think the people who need to be worried are the adults. Like, I think we're the ones who are going to have the most trouble with our social skills.
We've gotten kind of used to things being one way.
That's right.
So thank you, Christy. So on the flip side of the talk about living in the same house and dealing with your spouse sometimes in tight quarters like that all the time, we have the opposite question, which is, how do you make time for each other? As it is, there's so much stress on your relationships. You can't go to restaurants and sit down. How can we make time for each other and have special time away from the kids?
It's a really good question. One thing I've talked to a lot of people about is everyone kind of needs the Hallmark card moment right now. We need somebody to write in a card all the things that need to be shared to each other that we are kind of taken for granted or just assume or just overwhelmed. I really appreciate that you do this and this. I really miss this time with you. So the first thing I talk about, again, I guess it goes back to my communication, is think about what would you miss about the person that you love in your home, and what do you appreciate that they do, and take the time to share it with them. You have to get creative today, clearly, for that quality time. Some couples will say, I'll get up even earlier in the morning and sneak out so that the kids don't wake up, so we have a moment. Some folks I've worked with have said, I put on a movie, let them eat whatever they want, and we say mom and dad are doing date night, and they might be on an iPad in their room, but we've created, how do we create this time? Because if you don't plan for it, if you don't nurture your primary relationship, it's a little like putting your mask on. If you don't connect with each other and work on that, that's pretty important foundation, right, for the whole house. So I would say it's communication around what you value, telling them that, I really miss, but we'll get to, how do we do it differently? The last thing I often tell people is, think about, what did you guys used to love to do? Did you play cribbage? Did you play cards? Was there anything that within the house it's not the same that you could say we could do? And finally, sometimes just sitting and talking, even if it's just for 10 minutes, and remember when we went on vacation 2 years ago and we did this, connecting that way. There's even studies that talk about in the
Yeah.
brain and how that's helpful.
Well,
And it's
pictures.
helpful as an individual as well as a couple. So it really is being creative, and it's tricky right now, but I think at least talking about that and both people being on the same page. I miss this time. How do we get there? It might not be exactly the same, but still trying to come up with something that's important.
Great, thanks. And so there are a couple questions about our children, Shannon, about how to recognize stress. One parent commented that my child comes up to me and says that I'm stressed, but they don't look stressed, nor do they really understand what stress means. So what are they saying? I guess the translation of that question is, how do we know when we see stress? What are some outward manifestations? And how would you compare that to manifestations of a real disorder or clinically important anxiety?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And it's tough for a number of reasons. I think, the audience tonight, I think it's a wide range of ages we're talking about. So
Yeah.
what makes my job a little tough is we're talking about K through 8, and there's a wide range of development that happens in those ages.
Mhm.
So, I think I'll try to answer it the best I can. I think, it's possible that kiddo knows what stress is. I think, a good prompting question for the parent might be, well, tell me about what's stressing you out. Tell me about what's going on, and see if you can kind of pull out from them what that means to them, right? What does the stress to that child mean? But I think, in younger kids, stress and overwhelm might be another way to think about it, is, kids who are acting out, kids who are crying a lot and you don't really know why. Kids who are lashing out. And then there's the kids who just sort of withdraw into themselves and aren't talking a ton. So those can all be signs of stress and anxiety. It gets a little hairy because there's a lot of overlap between the two. Stress is our body's normal physical response to change, and then anxiety is often sort of a side effect of prolonged stress. And actually, so is depression. So, I think in a situation like this, it's entirely possible that what we're seeing from our kids, it could be more along the lines of anxiety, because it has been this prolonged stressful experience that we're all going through, right? So I think anxiety, panic symptoms are often sort of exclusive to anxiety. So really having difficulty breathing, or feeling like the room is spinning, or not being able to calm down. I think that the inability to control like worried thoughts, sleep problems, avoidance is a huge indicator of anxiety, right? If all of a sudden they're not doing these things and they're refusing to, and they're throwing tantrums to have to do them, I think avoidance is it's the number one coping strategy for anxiety. So just looking out for that kind of thing in your child if you have concerns about anxiety. But, stress is a normal response to a stressor.
And they're certainly experiencing that.
Yes, they are.
Yep. Okay, I think I'll do one more question for each of you, if that's okay. And so this, I guess, comes, from me, Christy, because I'd love to sleep more. I would, but I can't go to bed. Or I get there, you might not be able to turn off. There's a lot of noise going on in your head. So how do folks manage that?
That's a good one. I mean, it's complicated, and especially now with sleep. I mean, my first response to that is two things. One, walking through what you would call good sleep hygiene, and looking at, what do I do the last 2 hours before I go to bed? What am I in charge of? How do I wind down? Do I have any sense of a routine that isn't just busy, 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 get into bed? Why don't I fall asleep? How come I'm not falling asleep? Okay. So the first thing I would look at is kind of diagnostically those things, and watching caffeine, and even just how much beverages and drinks you have that could wake you up at night. The second thing, and the big thing right now that's keeping us up often, is our thoughts, our worries, right? We can distract ourselves all day, but as soon as we hit the pillow, all of a sudden, boy, the flood of thinking. Um, a lot of times I encourage people, it's not about once you've hit the pillow that you want to start thinking about these things. You want to plan. I call it a worry time. You plan a time a day, maybe a couple hours right after dinner. You take 2 minutes, you write down every last worry that's on your mind. You just list everything. And there's something therapeutic about getting it out on paper and seeing it. And with that, often, it's good to have another column that says, what can I do about it? Some of them, can I plan? Is there anything I can do about it? And some you leave. So the second bit of recommendation is plan to look at worry time. And if that's part of it, at another time of the day, or maybe even walking through in your mind, what am I worried about? What if I imagine everything goes right? I never think of that. I always think of worst case scenario, right? And walk through it. Sometimes it is helpful to plan. Okay, I'm worried if I do this and I've got to worry about my mom and then helping the kids. And what if she comes in the room when all right, here's my plan. I'll barricade the door and then I'll do this. And literally thinking through to distract yourself. This is when distracting yourself with some breathing, an audible book, these sorts of things. Headspace is super valuable. There's even one part that says, so you can't go back to sleep. And it walks you through a meditation to do at that point. So the last thing I'll say about it is, one of the biggest troubles that they find with insomnia or not getting to sleep is the worry that you can't go to sleep. The cognitive worry of, oh no, if I don't go to sleep, I have a busy day tomorrow. So what I encourage people with that is say, well, what are you going to do? You're going to rest. So if you don't go to sleep, is there anything you can adjust tomorrow? Can you get up a little later? Are you going to have more caffeine? Can you get takeout for dinner? How do you cope with the fact that, well, I can't will myself to sleep? So what if that's part of my worry when I hit the pillow? So I think it's a good question. I think it's one that we all struggle with right now. Some are better at getting to sleep, but I would really look at, are you paying attention to those big three? Exercise is huge. And even if it's just doing some stretching before bed, take a shower, that sort of thing that you wouldn't typically do. Okay.
Great, thanks a lot. And last question, this is for Shannon. There have been a lot of questions about how to help keep your kids on track. How do we keep our kids motivated? And the questions comes out more like, why won't they do their work? But I think what the parents are asking is how to keep them motivated. That's my interpretation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I probably wouldn't want to do my work in the pandemic either. Well, I think, look, there's two types of motivation. There's extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. And I think, intrinsic motivation is the motivation we all wish our kids had, right? It's this internal motivation, this internal drive to like excel and get your work done quickly, and right. And it's great when that exists. But I think for most of us, it's not there all the time. And it's certainly not there for kids all the time. And so we need a little bit of extrinsic motivation, right? So some external motivators to help drive us forward. But I think one of the things to think about is how we as adults handle activities or jobs or whatever that we don't want to do. So like Teresa, you're somebody with a really long to-do list, I'm sure. So how do you handle your to-do list? Like, what's your process for getting through everything in a day?
Oh my gosh, I guess I organize, I prioritize. Every day is a matter of triaging and coordinating.
Right. So like what comes first, what comes next, right? So are you someone who does the hardest things first? Are you someone who kind of saves the hardest things to last? Do you have a process for that?
Oh, well, gosh, I'm no expert at this either, but I think I deal with the immediate concern first.
Uh-huh.
The thing that's due that day or within minutes. So I triage by time.
Yeah.
And for bigger projects, I tend to parse them into small pieces. I do this a lot. I'll take a long-term project and have expected steps. And so I try to work on those in the background over time. But invariably, you end up in crunch time on one or two of them along the way.
Yeah. So I think that we all as adults, like that's your process for getting through a to-do list, right? And I'm sure there's things on your list that you don't want to do.
Yeah.
are things that you just want nothing to do with, and you like
Yeah.
And so I think we all have our different ways of handling those, and as parents we can verbalize that, right? So like as we're looking at our day and having our kids within earshot, talk it through, right? Model for them what that looks like, because we aren't born knowing how to prioritize. We aren't born knowing what should come first and what should come next, right? These are very complicated concepts for kids. And sometimes we have to really hold their hand at first until they become better at doing that sort of thing. You know, I think you have some people who do like, what do you call it, swallowing the frog. So they do the hardest thing first, right? And then they save the easiest things for later, because then it's kind of a breeze. You have some people who save the hardest thing for last, because maybe they'll get the motivation up to do it as they're kind of working through it, right? You have some people who, like me, who procrastinate, right? But I always reframe that, and you know what? I'm creating time pressure. I'm making, so I have this like this necessity to do these things, right? So it's okay to talk those things out with your kids, kind of figure out maybe where they are at with some of those things, what kind of person they are, because they're probably going to be a little bit different than us. You know, but I think that when you're really having trouble getting kids to do things, some things have to be non-optional, right? And so what you want to do is sort of make sure you're identifying those things that aren't optional, but giving them choices wherever you can. You want them to feel autonomous in the things that they're doing. So, you know, choosing where they can do the work, or, you know, what order they do it in, or any of those sort of more controllables, but the work itself is not optional. And that, you know, there's something in psychology that we literally call grandma's rule, which is all the other fun stuff has to wait. Like you have to do this thing that's non-optional first before you can do anything that's fun. And so, you know, sorry about it, but it's just gotta wait. And I think that if you have a kid who is able to take breaks by doing those fun things and then can come back to it, that's great. But that's not a lot of kids. So those fun things need to sort of wait until after the work is done. That's an extrinsic motivator, right? And then there's always positive reinforcements, right? You can reward them for doing something hard. That's totally acceptable. We don't call it bribery in psychology. We call it positive reinforcement. And it's a very useful tool. So those are sort of some things to think about when you're really stuck with a kid who just isn't doing their work. You know, and I think too, like I said in the beginning, having a conversation with them about it, really connecting with them on how overwhelming this must feel, how much they're having to do and do it by themselves, and right, like just making sure that they understand that you understand what they're having to go through. And that might make some room for them to be more compromising in what they're willing to try.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you, ladies, so very much. I think that concludes our talk today and our presentation. So any other thoughts for our group the end of our talks?
I mean, I will just say, like, this is hard and we're all doing the best we can, and that is good enough, right? If you're trying, that means you're doing something. So
Yeah, I think it's just important to support each other too. I know many people are feeling overwhelmed and feeling okay with being overwhelmed, but knowing that there's a way out of this. We can't control the stress, but we can work on how we respond to it. And there's things that we can feel some hope about, that can improve. And, you know, we do live in a pretty amazingly grateful area of the world, and area where our kids go to school. And as hard as it is for us, it's harder someplace else for someone else. And sometimes putting all of that in context can help distance us from kind of going down that rabbit hole. But, you know, I'm super grateful that everybody made time tonight to show up and listen, and especially in this format. And thank you for organizing all of this, Teresa. I know you're a busy lady, and finding time to pull this off wasn't easy either.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. And again, I agree. Thanks all of you for showing up, and tell a friend, reach out to one another. Let's take care of each other. When we say, how you doing? And they say, great, say, how are you doing? And I think you might hear a little bit more, if you have the time, that is.
Yeah.
Then ask them how they're doing. And it just goes so far just to have someone hear you sometimes. So this has been wonderful. Say, I'm going to send a little questionnaire out afterwards to see how you all feel about our presentation today. And this might help me to kind of brainstorm into where we might go next with the masterclass series. So I look forward to your thoughts, and thanks everybody.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see a lot of applause on here. It's great.
Aw, thanks, everyone.
Oh, wait, a little reaction button. I'm going to put my applause.
Look at you, fancy.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.